Good evening. Looks like the logins are slowing down, so we might begin. And I think I'll begin just to be considerate of everyone's time tonight. Again, good evening all. Thank you everyone for joining us in tonight's event. My name is Mariah Morgan from Nome, and I work at UAF Northwest Campus as the HR Personnel and Office Manager, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm excited and honored to be a part of the series and assisting as a facilitator tonight. I just want to start by acknowledging that those at our Troth Yeddat campus in Fairbanks are on unceded customary lands of the Dene people of the Tanana River. In Nome, we are on Inupiaq, Yupik, and Siberian Yupik lands, and we honor the continued fight for the rights of our First Peoples and stand with them in solidarity and action. At UAF, we are growing our institution into a socially just and caring institution of higher education. This new ongoing speaker series, known as Shine a Light, Promoting Conversations on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, is designed to encourage understanding, build empathy, and engage us all in thinking critically about our worldviews. This series is led by the Northwest Campus, but like all great diversity efforts, there are many partnerships and collaborations. I would like to thank UAF's Department of Equity and Compliance and NANIC Diversity and Action Center for partnering with the Northwest Campus to bring the series to reality. There are several excellent topics that will be a part of the series, such as discussion on Black history in Alaska, women's history with focus on Alaska Native women that were civil rights leaders, and internalized oppression. Although we are looking forward to these excellent presentations, I am pleased to announce tonight's discussion led by Yvonne Peter, titled Uncivilized, A Context for Alaska Native Equity. Yvonne Peter most recently served as Vice Chancellor for Rural and Community and Native Education of the University of Alaska Fairbanks from July 2014 to January 2021. A UAF alumnus, Peter is Gwich'in and Koyukon from Arctic Village, Alaska, where he served 3 years as a tribal chief. He currently serves as a board member in the Gwich'in Council International, which represents Gwich'in Nation interests in the Arctic Council Forum, and on the board of directors to the University of the Arctic. His work has focused on incorporating Indigenous knowledge and practices into healing, leadership development, and Alaska Native language programs. He holds a baccalaureate degree in Alaska Native Studies and a master's degree in rural development. He resides in Fairbanks with his wife and 4 children. We hope you join us each month as we navigate through different topics. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that Yvonne may be able to address at the end of his speech. You're more than welcome to use the chat feature throughout the presentation, but please funnel any questions that you may want addressed through the Q&A feature. And without further ado, please welcome Yvonne Peter.
Shalak Nai, Jaka Guare, Shoji Yvonne Peter Oji, Washain Ogotsanitli got Tananguichi, University of Alaska Fairbanks, Guath In, Senior Research Scientist at Center for Alaska Native Health Research, Ethli. Want to say good evening to everyone. My name is Yvonne Peter. As you heard in my introduction, I originally come from Washain O, which is a small village in northern Alaska, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. I'm really excited to have been invited to be the first speaker in this series of Shine a Light. I want to put forward a couple of disclaimers as I jump into this conversation with you all this evening. The first of which in this, it was hard for me to narrow down what I was going to cover and how deep I would be able to go in the different areas that I'll be hitting upon this evening. But I decided, since this was the first in the speaker series and that others will be going deeper into things, as you heard, into topics such as Native women in civil rights history within Alaska, I chose to keep this presentation this evening at a somewhat higher level. That being said, I will be covering topics that include political science, history, law, linguistics, and my disclaimer is that I'm not a lawyer or a linguist or any have that in my academic background, but that those areas are areas through experience and through my study and research that I found to be very critical and important as we move on a trajectory of both healing on our individual level, communal level, but also in systemic transformation. And so a lot of that, what you'll be hearing this evening from me is somewhat of a reflection of a piece of what I found most important and relevant in my own growth and development and journey as an Alaska Native man, and also as an Alaska Native person, in the context of trying to understand what our people and communities have been through that have resulted us being in the situation that we're in today in the broadest sense. Before I jump into the slides of my presentation, I also want to provide a few acknowledgements. So as I was thinking about what to cover, well, one more disclaimer, which, as you also heard in my intro, that I just most recently served 6.5 years as the vice chancellor here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And as I was reflecting a bit in preparation for this presentation, I realized that this is my first dive really back into academia more per se, as opposed to administration, university administration. So that being said, I think that I also fit the category of being a recovering administrator. And so thank you all for being the first group of getting to have a presentation for me on some of these areas of topics of academic study that I'm really excited about and glad to engage in. So in preparation for this presentation, also, there's a few things that are happening at UAF. One of them is that we've been working on a required training for all of our faculty staff on Alaska Native cultural awareness, and that training is called In This Place. There's a team that has been working on that training. I've been contributing and participating in that team, which included members and contributions from folks such as Kathleen Hildebrand, Carrie Stevens, Debbie Mekiana, and also some contributions from Kevin Illingworth, who are all faculty at UAF. And so some of the content in the slides were generated through some of that work that we were doing on that training, and that will be finalized here this semester. And also another acknowledgement is another part of my history was co-founding a community-led organization called Native Movement with my partner, Ine Begay. And most recently, I participated in a training that we had provided to WGBH in Boston. And so I got to do some work on some of the slides in the presentation as well. And so I incorporated in this presentation elements and pieces that I felt were most relevant as a part of this evening's discussion. And I'm excited to be able to do that. So I think those are my disclaimers and acknowledgements. And with that, I'll jump into my talk this evening. Earlier, you heard the land acknowledgement that was already provided, acknowledging the Alaska Native Nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. That was covered by Mariah. You see here in the picture, a picture of Chief Peter John, who was a mentor to many, including myself, the late Chief Peter John from Minto, and he provided a lot of that foundational guidance, understanding. And he comes from the Diné community in the Lower Tanana area. The land acknowledgements are important not only in giving thanks to Indigenous communities who've had relationships to this land for generations, but also with the recognition of historical and ongoing legacy of colonialism. I know that that's a mouthful, and later in my presentation, I'm going to get to some definitions of colonization and colonialism to better understand that. But I think that this statement with the additional part below of acknowledging that this is a point of reflection for us as we work towards dismantling colonial practices is something that I hope is one of the key points and takeaways from my presentation tonight, and something that I'll be thinking about as we get through this. The picture there is of the Tanana chiefs who came together in 1912, I believe, in an initial meeting with the federal government to advocate for the Indigenous people's rights in interior Alaska. All right, in our land acknowledgement, the word Alaska Native Nations is used, and um, for those of you who may know, I have a kind of a love relationship with understanding political science and thinking about political science, and how has it impacted the journey of our peoples and communities. And this definition I just pulled off of Oxford Languages, which is a nation as defined as a large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, language, inhabiting a particular country or territory. And from my perspective, of course, our Alaska Native nations and Indigenous nations around the world fulfill that definition as a nation. But the underlying question is, who gets to decide who is a nation? And also another question we'll get to a little bit later is, who gets to decide who is human? And wherein having that kind of authority and ability to make those determinations, of course, has impacted the history of our relationships and the contemporary challenges and situations that we find ourselves in. So earlier, in the land acknowledgement also, we covered that the Trothieta campus here in Fairbanks is on the traditional lands of the Danat people. The Danat people are one of, and it's kind of redundant actually if you know the language, because Danat in the language simply means person. And the Danat people of interior Alaska in the Fairbanks area are part of a large language family known as the Na-Dene language family. This map on the lighter side comes from some work in development by Professor Emeritus James Carey, and it shows detail of the roughly 50 indigenous nations that are a part of the Na-Dene language family, and each meeting that definition of an indigenous nation. Here in Alaska, we have roughly 11 Dene nations, and among them are where the one that I come from, one of the ones that I come from, which is the Gwich'in Nation that you see in the upper portion of, I think that's like a red, purple, pinkish set of languages. There's roughly 11 languages in Alaska that are a part of the Dene language family. And something that many folks don't know or understand is that those languages are not mutually intelligible. We are not able to communicate. For example, from those of us from the Yukon Flats, Gwich'in, Fort Yukon area, you simply go down a couple of villages and they're speaking a different Dene languages, a different Dene language, which would be Koyukon. And so I think it's really important for us to understand, and this is largely an outcropping, of course, of the impacts of colonization, who defines who we are as people, and what different generations of people were taught to call ourselves. In this case, of course, you'll hear commonly used in Alaska the word Athabascan, although Athabascan is a language family, not a specific nation of people per se, although it's widely used and commonly used and accepted among our people in the interior. And it's what most people external to the Dene people and communities best understand. But this map also reflects, it's a map from the Alaska Native Language Center that reflects the other indigenous nations and languages across the state of Alaska. And I understand there's some work underway by some indigenous scholars in our state to update and adapt this map with more definition and meaning. And I'm really excited about seeing the outcomes of some of their work and their efforts. You'll notice that I'm keeping a pretty quick pace. I have, as I was pulling this presentation together, I realized that I had about 2 hours of topics to cover. And so I'm going to keep us moving pretty swiftly. And as I said, hitting a high level. So this is from our In This Place training. And I really like this because it reflects and demonstrates this long inhabitants and time immemorial history that we've had here as Alaska Native nations when compared to the Western contact over these last roughly 280 years that I'll largely be speaking to as we move forward. But I want to just lay this out there to give a time perspective. And often when I was as a young boy growing up in Vashon Arctic Village with my grandfather, who was born in the early 1900s, who was raised by his parents and grandparents who were born in the mid 1800s. I often thought about even the 1800s as not that long ago, but in Western contexts and in the education systems, we're taught as if though that was so long ago, it's not relevant. Although from our perspective, it very much is relevant, and our ancestry is so critical to our understanding of who we are, where we came from, and ultimately to provide us a foundation to understand where we're going. But I wanted to start with this and talk a little bit about the indigenous, the robust indigenous knowledge, understanding, and thinking that we had that enabled our people to survive for tens of thousands of years here in this land. I saw this quote in a brochure, I think it was, when I was traveling overseas. I won't name the country, but I really liked it when I took a look at it because as you can read, it goes on here talking about the icy desert, the Deathland. These are only some of the names given to the Arctic by its researchers in various times. At the same time, the ingenious people have for centuries called the place their home and land of ancestors and a sacred place. And I'm pretty confident that the ingenious was intended to be indigenous. Nonetheless, I love the substitute in for the word ingenious on this slide, and I think that really reflects the depth of the knowledge, understanding that is immersed in what's often referred to as indigenous knowledge and wisdom. I'm really excited about some of the research that's happening and work that's being brought forward currently in this area that I'm familiar with relative to my own nation, the Gwich'in Nation. And so I wanted to start with just a little bit of that knowledge and understanding. This chart that was developed by Kenneth Frank, I believe along with Craig Mishler and with the contributions of many of our elders among the Gwich'in Nation, but Ait Anojri, meaning caribou bone names, or the biological names of the bones for the caribou, which of course, as Gwich'in people, we have a very intimate relationship with culturally, spiritually, and for our sustenance of our people. And I wanted to include some of this work because I think it's so important, especially for any young people who might be watching this presentation, to understand the sophistication of our indigenous knowledge, understanding, and sciences that existed prior to Western contact and that are so important for us to continue to highlight and uplift. And I'm really grateful to Kenneth and others who contributed to bringing some of this work forward. One other example of some of this recent research and work, two other examples actually that correlate to each other. One is the Dinjejuk Yahdi, which is the Gwich'in astronomy, and really laying out, of course, the different star systems, but also the stories behind them as they correlate to our worldview and epistemologies as Gwich'in people and our creation stories. And that research was done with by Chris Cannon, along with a Gwich'in elder, Paul Herbert. Really grateful for that work and some of the work that Chris has brought forward in comparative analysis with other Dene nations outside of the Gwich'in Nation, validating both the understandings, thinking, and transference of storytelling and names among Dene nations more broadly. And then on the other side of this slide, we're looking at the Proto-Dene template, which is some work by Professor Emeritus James Carey, that lays out the directional systems within, in this case, the Adna, but it's more broadly applicable within the Dene nations as well, understanding how we spatially determined where we are, where we were, different places, and how to define movement, both externally and internally in environments. And when correlated with this directional system with a 10,000 plus year old place naming system and the astronomy, you essentially segue and have created a Gwich'in GPS mapping system on how our people navigated the lands in interior Alaska. And I don't want to go too deeply into that, but I wanted to start with kind of this rich knowledge, understanding, and history that we had prior to contact, that we still have, and that's so important for us to be uplifting in our school systems and education systems for our younger generations and others. I know it's kind of an abrupt switch to go from something so, from my perspective, so positive and uplifting back to kind of this history of where did we get and how did we get to where we're at currently, with a few definitions that I promised earlier, one of them being colonialism. Uh, and you'll see where I note whether or not where I was pulling some of these definitions. So this comes from the Native Movement Training: the policy or practice of acquiring political control over another country land, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. So I'm sure that rings a bell for folks, and it's simply straightforward and put there about practices of colonialism. And I'll get to one type of colonialism that was practiced here in Alaska, settler colonialism, in a couple slides here. Colonization, the process of devaluing and dehumanizing Native people through both formal and informal methods in order to justify exploiting them in their homelands. We'll get, when I get to talking about some of the federal Indian law and history, as well as its application to Alaska Native tribes, how colonialism and colonization were put into practice within Alaska. And before I go before I go further to the next slide, I also want to, and I should have begun with this earlier, acknowledge that I'm covering a lot of heavy topics in my own experience and journey of learning about the history that I'm about to dive into here. It was in some instances traumatizing as I learned about some of the experiences that my own great-grandparents or grandparents' parents went through, and that I was also navigating as an Alaska Native person. And it was really important as I learned about this history to have mentors or a means to be able to also allow myself to process some of the feelings and emotions that emerged as I learned about this history, which largely took place after I began to study at the University of Alaska in what I like to say back in the 1900s. But that process, and so I want to acknowledge that some of what I'm covering may be heavy and new to some people, and if so, and if you're kind of struggling with your emotions and feelings around some of what I cover, I would like to offer for those of you listening and tuned in this evening, that if you want to reach out to me to debrief some of that, I'm more than happy to be available to do that for folks. So with that, let's move on. So settler colonialism. Settlers, and this comes from Tuck and Yang, as cited. Tuck is an Unungak scholar, and Yang is a partner of hers. Settlers are not immigrants. Immigrants are beholden to the indigenous laws and epistemology, or ways of knowing, of the lands they migrate to. Settlers become the law, supplanting indigenous laws and epistemologies. So what does this mean in the context of colonization and colonialism? A simple way to think about it, I suppose, because some of this gets very academic in nature with some of the words that are being used, is when I think about, and this is something I reflected on in a recent panel that I participated in on Indigenous knowledge and researching in Indigenous communities, is if as a researcher, as a student, you were to go and study in, let's say, someplace in Africa, Nigeria, for example, coming into their community, you'd want to understand some of their laws, customs, culture. Ideally, you'd want to be respectful of the communities that are there and their nationhood, their protocols, their practices. And so you would be coming in with that sense of understanding that you're moving into another people's lands and that you're wanting to adapt to the ways of that place. In stark contrast to communities like Alaska, where settler colonialism has been practiced, where there's none of that sense of importance for many people when they're coming into indigenous communities, villages, and practices. And so that is just to highlight some of the nuance of this kind of definition around settler colonialism. So now jumping to some of the legal tenets of what enabled colonization and colonialism to take place more broadly on a global scale, but as it applies, as I narrow it in here in Alaska, is what you'll hear often referred to as papal bulls that come out of the Vatican. This one is one of the papal bulls of 1452 has noted that essentially was a determination made by the Church and the Vatican to say that it's okay to practice enslavement and also the theft and taking of indigenous peoples' lands based on these moral and legal standards that are being laid out by the Vatican. While you might think of this as something that happened long ago in the 1400s, these very much were referenced later, as I'll get to, in the United States context, both around this idea of the doctrine of discovery, that non-indigenous peoples essentially, quote unquote, discovered the lands and had the moral and legal authority to carry out genocide, essentially, certainly cultural genocide and theft of indigenous lands here, that was based on these doctrines. The papal bulls there's been requests dating back many decades now to each new pope to rescind these papal bulls justifying the enslavement and taking of lands in particular in the Americas, but the Vatican has chosen not to lift those from the books. And so that's something that you'll probably see and hear about more action being taken on as things move forward, as we really think about how we dismantle some of these underlying tenets, ideologies, and thinking that enable colonial practices that are really quite harmful and oppressive. All right, now we jump into components of federal Indian law. All right, I just got my note that I'm needing to keep pace. And so I'm not going to be able to cover all of what I've listed here as bullets as a part of federal Indian policy, but I felt like keeping most of these in here in case people want to take a snapshot, or later, if these slides are shared, you could double back and do some of your own investigation into more of the details here. But of most significant, of the greatest significance, I want to highlight just a few elements of thought that underlie some of the thinking. So first, in the US Constitution, recognizing indigenous nations as foreign nations, I believe through the Commerce Clause, giving Congress the right to conduct commerce with foreign nations as well as the Indian nations here in the United States. And so embedded within the US Constitution is this underlying tenet of indigenous nations being acknowledged. I won't really focus a lot on the Indian Civilization Act or the Removal Act, but both of those really have to do with some really major atrocities that highlight the pieces and elements of the westward expansion. And really, if you look into, in particular, that Removal Act, you'll see why Andrew Jackson, among many indigenous communities, is referred to as the Indian killer, and why the uplifting of some of these figures in a historical context are painful and atrocious to people coming from within indigenous communities. The Marshall Trilogy it's a set of 3 Supreme Court cases that essentially define indigenous nations as domestic dependent nations. So this is where you get this buildup of an understanding that, yes, the United States government recognizes that there are indigenous nations. They have some degree of sovereignty or ability to determine their own future, but they are under the dependency and what's called plenary power of the United States government. And so that Marshall Trilogy you'll hear referred to substantially and significantly from the time there forward in relationship to kind of these underlying tenets of federal Indian law. 1871, treaty making ended with Indian tribes, and this becomes really important in the context of Alaska Native nations and Alaska Native peoples, because, as you'll see as we get into kind of the Alaska-centric history relative to federal Indian law, this determination by the US government occurred shortly after the Treaty of Cession and the transfer of the claimed ownership of Alaska from Russia over to the United States. And so with the end of treaty making, essentially treaty making, of course, is the an agreement made between two sovereign nations. And so it was kind of this additional step being made within the United States government to shift away from the uplifting of indigenous nations as greater sovereigns. So that, I think, ending of treaty making is really important. It's also, it correlates, if you take a deeper dive into the westward expansion, some of the history of what are referred to as some of the last Indian wars in the continental United States. And it's in this era that some of the few stories and names that often people do get exposed to in the US, like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and Geronimo and other war chiefs and leaders of tribes in the continental US. I won't go too much into the citizenship of Indians or Alaska Native people per se. Just to context, as I build up towards that, one of the next bullets on the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, but it wasn't until very recently in the context of Alaska Native history and Indigenous history and perspective that our peoples were vitally entitled to citizenship rights within the United States in our own homelands. It's really a piece of this history that I'll double back on here when we talk about Alaska, but inclusive of my own grandparents who helped raise me, for example, not being citizens, not being able to vote, own land, own business, and being significantly discriminated against within our own home here, and a lot of the trauma and hardship that is associated with that treatment and experience. I skimmed over the Dawes Act of 1887, which I think is really an important piece of the taking of a huge swath of indigenous land in the continental United States. It was also referred to as the General Allotment Act. It was basically in these waves of legislation and treatment of indigenous peoples within a US context, one of those moments where the US government had to figure out what type of action can be taken from their perspective to steal additional lands from indigenous populations. And this was one of those most significant acts doing that in a contemporary time. And is also a underlying component, in addition to many others, of the violation of all treaties that the United States made with indigenous nations, which also from an indigenous perspective, as you can imagine, if you're making agreements with another sovereign nation and they violate every single one of those agreements, you tend to build some distrust for your relationship with that nation. And the Dawes Act is a piece of that history. It also checkerboarded, what's called checkerboarding. So if you look at maps of Indian reservations in Lower 48, you'll see that the land is checkerboarded, and the intent of that was essentially to further assimilate indigenous peoples into the mainstream US culture and break down in the Lower 48 the social structures that were in place that enabled for the worldview, spirituality, traditions, and cultural practices of indigenous peoples to thrive. Indian Reorganization Act, I'll get to that again here a little bit later under the Alaska-centric focus, but then two other broad eras in federal Indian policy. You'll often hear folks who study federal Indian law and history talk about kind of the waxing and waning of the sentiment of the US Congress, the president, the Supreme Court, and the way that they treat indigenous peoples within the United States. In this era of the 1950s, it was commonly referred to as the termination era, where there was this push to take the remaining lands, terminate the domestic dependent nation sovereignty of indigenous peoples, with this idea that will somehow just join the theoretical melting pot of the United States. And then the self-determination era, roughly 1972, 1990, which again, I'll get to in the context of Alaska, where there was more support and understanding surrounding indigenous peoples in the US context. Gosh, 10 minutes. Okay, so you may wonder about the title of my presentation, Uncivilized Context, and that uncivilized, of course, comes from the Treaty of Cession. From an indigenous perspective, of course, Russia never really owned our lands. They owned a claim under a Western legal structure, again, that was founded in the papal bulls from the Pope, and then agreed to by largely Western nations as they engaged with each other in kind of this global colonization. In the Treaty of Cession, though, of 1867, where the claim to ownership of Alaska was transferred from Russia over to the United States, the indigenous tribes were acknowledged. If you read this Article 3, which I won't read in all, you'll see that we're acknowledged as the uncivilized tribes, and that ultimately, based on this treaty anyways, we would just be subject to United States law and legislation. This becomes important later as Alaska Native people push to native land claims and human and civil rights, which ultimately has been 150, 160, maybe 200-year endeavor of Alaska Native people within our own lands to basically work towards equity for our people within our own homeland. But this is the source and genesis of the title of my presentation of our acknowledgement as uncivilized tribes in the Treaty of Cession. This is a broadly well-known quote, although I'm covering a lot of things that might be, some of you may be thinking of as kind of basic and introductory, but I found, and many others have found, that much of this context and history and experience is, because it's not being taught in our K-12 systems and even taught in universities largely, unless required or unless the students are interested in learning about this history, it's still important, I think, for us to be uplifting this knowledge understanding. So the idea here, kill the Indian, save the man, of course, is of the boarding school era. And we were not free of that here in Alaska, like elsewhere across North America. And for examples within my own family, my mother having been sent out to the Wrangell Institute and having pretty atrocious experiences to share about being denied her ability to speak her language and practice her culture. And she had one interesting story that correlates back to my opening talk about the Non-Diné language family, which is she had mentioned to me that when she first went to Wrangell, one of the people there, I'm not sure if it was a teacher or a staff, asked her what she was. And when she responded that she was Gwich'in, she was told, no, you're not Gwich'in, you're Athabascan. And when we think about, in a historical context, you begin to kind of connect the dots of how we began to adapt or adopt, I suppose, this determination of referring to us in the interior as Athabascan, even though, of course, we have our own names to the 11 nations that we have in the interior. But a major part, of course, of this boarding school era was, again, kind of another next wave and iteration of trauma. And it's really hard to explain, the significance of this impact, but as a father of 4 children myself now, when I try to imagine, and maybe those of you who are parents out there, if you can imagine your children being sent away to, let's say, China, just at 5 years old, not being able to communicate with you or their siblings for 3, 4, 5 years, being literally beaten or scolded for speaking English, I guess, in this case, or practicing whatever your spiritual tradition is. You can imagine how traumatic that was for the children, but also for the families and parents, and the disruption at a societal level that would have inflicted. And essentially, this is the experience of so many indigenous peoples in North America. All right, jumping forward. I'm going to have to skim over some of these. So I covered a little bit of the Treaty of Cession, the Indian Citizenship Act already covered. Indian Reorganization Act, it was passed in 1934 in the United States, continental US. It was applied to Alaska in 1936. It became really important in an Alaskan context because it provided Alaska Native nations and tribes to use a federal mechanism to attain recognition of their tribal governments and what could be broadly called Indian country status within federal Indian law, for those of you who are on a legal and political track. Of importance in the interior, in particular to my people story among the Gwich'in. We had a leader named Zhou Guotsun, or John Fredson, who was the first Dene person to graduate from college in the lower 48, who returned back to Alaska as a teacher and championed through the Indian Reorganization Act the establishment of the Vinetai Indian Reservation, which has really a long history in trying to push and champion the rights of Indigenous peoples within the context of Alaska. And there's a lot there, and there's a book there that you can read if you're interested more in that story. I talked about the Wrangell Institute already as one of the boarding schools here. A part of the history that's so incredible that I think other speakers are going to get to in this series later is really this civil rights movement in the context of Alaska, led by and championed by Alaska Native people. Elizabeth Pratovich, who others will probably get to in later presentations, really was one of the renowned champions around this 1945 Anti-Discrimination Act in the then territory of Alaska, which was really likely the first civil rights legislation in the United States. And so it's really exciting that there's growing recognition of some of the work that she contributed to. Statehood, I don't want to dive too much into statehood, but I do want to share kind of a little known piece of history that, something else was happening around 1945, which was World War II. And as World War II was coming to an end, there was kind of this global awakening and understanding that maybe colonization isn't that good of a thing. Hopefully we understood it a little bit before that, but certainly that was understood. And so within the establishment and formation of the United Nations, there was this broad mechanism that in conversation surrounding decolonization in the context of providing nations that were recently colonized to be able to have a vote of the people of those nations to determine whether or not they wanted to establish their own nationhood. And so you have a lot of that occurring in Africa through that United Nations mechanism. Alaska and Hawaii were both on those lists of territories that should have been provided that same opportunity for that vote of their indigenous populations. Within the context of the United States, the 1959 statehood election, which had some significant issues from an indigenous perspective, was used to kind of justify that there was a vote to determine whether or not to formally join the United States or be self-governing as its own nation. Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Gosh, I don't have time to really dive too deeply into that. I think most significant, though, that I want to highlight here is who is telling the history and the story of what has happened really impacts the way we feel, understand what has occurred. So in the context of the Native Claims Settlement Act, two things. As you learned earlier, the federal government was no longer doing treaty making with Indigenous nations. And so Alaska Native nations were never provided that opportunity to go into a direct nation-to-nation negotiation with the federal government over our lands and the US claims to our lands and territories. Instead, Congress unilaterally carried out a process to create an act to address Alaska Native land claims within the US legal framework. The end result being that Alaska Natives were only able to retain 44 out of roughly 365 million acres of our original homelands. That's roughly 12% or so of our lands. The rest were, of course, taken by the US federal government, and then some of that being redistributed. Of course, there's a lot of history and nuance in that. One other piece to it that I think is really concerning, just to me personally, is that in that Native Claims Settlement Act, Indigenous or Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights were extinguished. And this was something really shocking to me as a young scholar going through my undergraduate, to learn that we are among the only Indigenous peoples in all of North America who don't have the right to practice our ancestral relationship with the land, and in particular the animals, through our practices of and stewardship of hunting and fishing. And that continues to be a significant challenge and inequity within Alaska Native communities. Essentially, many of our people being criminalized for practicing our way of life and who we are out in the land. Again, I won't have time to get into too many of the details around Molly Hooch and Nilka, the Katie John case. Federal recognition of Alaskan tribes in 1993, but that's so recent and fresh that our tribes are finally added to that list of federally recognized tribes. An amazing story underlying that as well, related to the work of another Lower 48 champion in restoring her tribe there in the Lower 48. So something to definitely learn about, or maybe from another one of these lectures. And then lastly there, I just threw on the state of Alaska recognizes Alaska Native tribes in 2020. And so all of this is to highlight and emphasize that we're not there. We're very much, I think, on this trajectory of human and civil rights work that, from an Indigenous and Alaska Native perspective, is just kind of this ongoing set of challenges and dynamics that we're facing, and adds to I guess the challenges of navigating the world and in our own homeland as Indigenous peoples. Okay, so this big history, broad history of colonization, colonialism. I won't get into it here, but I think maybe other presenters might tackle issues related to white supremacy, which is of course an outcropping of colonization and colonialism as it was carried out by European nations and then adopted by some of the nation states that were established here in the Americas. This was pulled from a book, White Fragility, by Robin DiAngelo, which I definitely recommend you all reading if you haven't, but it just kind of lays out some of the statistics, this course coming from 2016. Thankfully, a few of these have changed a little bit since that time, but it really depicts kind of the inequalities that persist within our nation. These are a few slides, of course, that many of you have seen time and again, I think, in presentations related to understanding the difference between equality and equity. Of course, equality is this theoretical idea that we're all taught and raised within the context of the United States, that we're all equal, and if we just put in the same amount of work, we'll end up in the same place in regards to the idea of becoming a successful person. But of course, this picture kind of reflects an understanding that that's not actually the case, and that in order for us to get to equity, there are different types of supports and mechanisms that are important to be in place for some folks. This one is a kind of an adaptation of that first slide that highlights the reality. Largely the history that pieces of that history that I covered of the boarding schools not being able to, for multiple generations for Indigenous peoples, including Alaska Native people, to own land, to own business, to have the right to vote, enabled this huge disparity in wealth, power, but also impacted the additional layers of challenges related to healing from what's referred to as the intergenerational traumas that have been affecting Alaska Native and Indigenous peoples in generations. As I mentioned, as one of those examples, the experience of my mother going to boarding schools, and then some of that impact being carried forward through the experiences of me and siblings. And so this kind of lays out this reality that even though we're all in the case of Alaska, we're all living in this state, have many similar pieces of laws that we have to adhere to and abide by. We're not all on even footing and ground, especially when you think about it in that context of accumulation of wealth. And then also, of course, I won't get into it too much here, but issues related to racism as well. This photo really kind of lays out the idea of the difference between, what does it mean to create equity? Throwing up a few boxes. This picture reflecting, look, what if we just transform the system itself and don't have to have the fence there, and then everyone having a true equal opportunity? What does that take? It absolutely takes systemic change, which I think will be brought up maybe in later talks. From an Indigenous perspective, though, when we think about that previous slide and the fence going away. Ultimately, we need to take it a step further, which I think is ultimately what is often referred to as decolonization, which is, in this picture, whose land are we actually on, and why are we watching this game? Why are we playing this game? And what's the context of that? And so it's kind of a framework of thinking about that. I'll leave you with just a few more slides and thoughts. Sorry, and there's not going to be a lot of time for Q&A here. I like this from Michael Yellowbird, who's a scholar from the Midwest. The restoration, his definition of decolonization, the restoration of cultural practices, thinking, beliefs, and values that were taken away or abandoned through colonization, but are relevant and are necessary for survival and well-being. Ultimately, that's really what I like about this is that's the vantage point through which I entered much of this work in my own dive into understanding what had occurred in a historical context to our people, communities, why in the context of Fairbanks are so many of our Alaska Native population and people of color living in the South Cushman area, needing rent assistance, or as my own family did in some cases, needing to go to seek other social services and support to be able to make it by, whereas largely that isn't the case in a broader context. So really, where do we need to go from here to heal, gain solid foundation under our ground, and also to build towards real equity? And a lot of that comes back to what I love to see, and which is happening, I think, more significantly, is tied to this revitalization of our culture, ceremonial practices, languages, and indigenous worldviews and understanding that I think are going to not only help provide a pathway forward that for indigenous and Alaska Native peoples, but also the knowledge and understanding that's embedded in our understanding within the indigenous community, having a positive impact more broadly within our population, and hopefully moving us towards a place of all living a much healthier, more balanced, more grounded life and livelihood. A couple last slides, which I won't get into, really come out of our tribal management, or now tribal governance program at UAF, really laying out some of what that, doubling back a little bit to that history of the civil rights work within Alaska that's been done, and some core understandings around tribal sovereignty and self-determination that I think are really important to dig into as we think about how do we move forward. And again, just continuing some of that definitions around self-determination. Ultimately, the thinking here is that Alaska Native people are best situated to understand the challenges that our people are facing, and therefore are best situated to be able to be in leadership and control of determining pathways forward to best address the challenges within our communities and people. And a piece of legislation I didn't cover earlier in the history was the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which was essentially this recognition at a congressional level of understanding that concept I just covered, which enabled, for example, in the Alaska case, our tribal governments to take over tribal government services from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and to take over healthcare services from the Indian Health Service. And at this point in time, what we see today in our Alaska Native healthcare system, Alaska Native Medical Center in Anchorage, as well as the Chief Andrew Isaac Center here, and others across the state and among our tribal institutions, is a radical increase in the quality of services for Alaska Native people, and slowly new models and ways of engaging and managing those systems that I think will, as I mentioned earlier, begin to play a more significant role as we move forward in helping to transform non-Indigenous systems as well. And the final thought coming from Maya Angelou is kind of these commitments about this work. I know I covered a lot, skimmed a lot of things at a high level. I think some important things to remember, not only from what I covered, but also from future presentations, is that this is a lifelong practice. The term woke being, the theoretical idea that we arrive at a place where we just are enlightened, in other words, enlightened. But really, it's a lifelong journey of learning, understanding, growing as human beings, understanding the validity of our feelings and our understanding, continuing to push forward with growth, and not really backing down from continuing this work, this hard work of having these conversations, of opening them up, And knowing that none of us are perfect, but it's so important for us to continue to think about and learn and move forward on a path that hopefully at the end of the day helps uplift each of us in our lives, but also helps provide a healthier and better foundation for future generations. With that, I think I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you so much for tuning in to I think what became a broad coverage of a lot of different topics, and we'll see what questions have emerged. Thanks.
Yes, thanks Yvonne for your time and for presenting tonight. We're now going to address some questions that came in during the presentation. Our first question was, when will the In This Place training be available and can non-UA people access it?
Great questions. We'll be working on that training starting this week with the team. I expect the training was developed for in-person, and of course now because of the pandemic we're navigating, it'll take a little bit for that to be adapted to an online format. But my hope is that by mid to late spring, we'll be able to be rolling that out for all folks at UA. There has been requests from outside of the university system for that training, a lot of demand for it. And I think that depending on how we move forward, we might be pulling in elements of some other agency and entity trainings that are on the same topic. And so we can kind of do a collective lift to a training that can be applicable more broadly, perhaps even outside of the context of simply the university. So my hope is that we do find a pathway to make that available beyond UAF.
All right, next question. How can K through 12 teachers access this authentic history? And that kind of goes with another question of, can you suggest any books that could give further detail or documentaries of Alaska Native history?
Two thoughts. One, for those of you who are listening who are excited and interested about this, we need in particular Alaska Native people who are interested in doing deeper dives, studying and writing about this history from an Indigenous perspective. We need curriculum at the K-12 level. We need curriculum at the post-secondary level. So anyone who's listening in and tuning into this presentation that's interested in that, I think there's a growing number of Indigenous scholars within Alaska that I think are very interested in seeing others join in so that they can begin the development of that curriculum. As far as a list of resources, I know that there's been a few people that have been collecting resource lists and maybe following this. I'll find a way to post or share that with those who registered for this presentation.
Thank you. What are a few things we can do at a local level to assist with decolonization?
Education. So I think there's work, to be done. Where are you living, for example? How much do you know about the local Indigenous nation, or in this case, Alaska Native Nation that comes from the land and place you're at? How much do you know about their history? So I think that the first steps in kind of this work around decolonization is really educating ourselves and taking the onus of that effort upon ourselves to go after that so that we can be better prepared to engage and find ways. Also, I think that, we all have our different strengths and interests and passions. And I really do encourage folks, especially younger folks, to become engaged where you're most inspired and where you feel yourself being called. And that could be in many different ways. It could be in working towards organizational systemic changes within institutions, government. It could be related to restoring your traditional songs and dances within your community, or expanding and writing new songs and dances. And so I think that there's many different ways for people to engage who are both Alaska Native and outside of the Alaska Native community that are really valuable and meaningful. And I think some of the best collaborations, especially when it comes to institutional and systemic changes within government and educational institutions, for example, come in where there are folks outside of the Alaska Native community doing the work, educating themselves, and then partnering up with Alaska Native scholars, academics, and leaders to help bring about some of the changes.
All right. One more question?
Yeah, sure. Let's do one more.
Okay. The Alaska State Constitution does not mention Alaska Native people. How would today look different if we had wording, not sure what, in reference to Alaska's Indigenous people?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'll tackle it exactly in the context of the question, because I would have to reread that to think about a little more depth. But I do think, as you saw in my presentation, that it's been so recent since 1993 at the federal level and 2020 at the Alaska state level that our Alaskan government is finally willing to recognize and acknowledge that Alaska Native tribes and Alaska Native nations exist in Alaska, and to treat us as partners, as sovereign partners in this effort. I think about, I do want to elaborate on this just a little bit because I think it's helpful for thinking about things. It's Alaska Native people are citizens of our federally recognized tribes or indigenous nations. We're citizens of the state of Alaska, and we're citizens of the United States government, just like other citizens in Alaska are citizens of Alaska and citizens of the United States, or citizens of other states. And with citizenship come certain rights and responsibilities. And I do think that those three sovereigns, the Alaska Native nations, the state government, and the federal government, have a long of history of relationship. And I do think that there needs to be a more proactive effort of educating folks in our state legislature, as well as folks more broadly across our state, about those three sovereigns and how we can better work together to provide services and support to all Alaskans across our state. And I think it's, from my perspective, a mutually beneficial, could be a mutually beneficial arrangement, but it ultimately does rely on the state, and not only the state. When I say that, it seems like some kind of a ethereal entity, but of citizens to understand this colonial history and why it's important to acknowledge Alaska Native nations and to work with Alaska nations as partners.
Thank you, Yvonne. And I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Please keep an eye out for our upcoming Shine a Light speaker series events at nwc.uaf.edu or facebook.com/uaf.nwc. If you'd like to share this recording or want to give feedback, you can do so by visiting the courses tab on our website, which is again nwc.uaf.edu. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.